G'day, listeners. This episode is proudly brought to you by our major sponsor, supshq.com.au. Use code BENS15 at checkout to receive 15% off on your next purchase. G'day, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of the Matter Mentality podcast. Now, it is week 3 in production, or I guess being live with the podcast for us. So, as of this week, the podcast was officially announced. So, to all of you who are listening now, you listened to a few weeks back, but at this episode, we are currently up to date with how live the episodes are and the podcast is going. So that is a huge milestone for us to actually have the podcast actually live and going, and people tuning in, watching, listening, subscribing. It's fantastic. Appreciate you all, and definitely appreciate the support that has come from this, as I think it's going to be a little bit different than people expect. It's going to be a little bit different than people are used to. We're going to get pretty real with some things. We're going to get pretty open with some things, and hopefully we can help a lot of people through their own problems, their own issues, through their own training, through their own development, through their own mental issues, and see what we can do. So this week, I wanted to get to an elephant in the room, and I know a lot of people know about this already, but for anyone who is new to the channel or new to myself or new to anything that Matter Athletica does, you're going to find a lot of residual reference to something that has happened to me that was rather significant and played a pretty huge milestone in kind of me becoming who I am. And I think it's kind of worth mentioning this early on so that it sets the premise to any conversation down the track or any situations down the track where it's sort of less awkward, less intense, less sort of full on for you to hear and understand. So the big elephant in the room for a lot of people that obviously know about it, but for me to make future jokes and references and conversation, is that my father passed away in 2018. So we had his 4-year anniversary of his passing on June 10th. And that has been pretty much one of the biggest moments in my life for shaping who I am. Now, why are we going to talk about it? Well, I think it's a pretty big moment for me. It's a pretty big shift in perspective and mindset to life and how I was doing things. I was already a pretty full-on person back then and before this, but I think it was at this moment that a lot of things started to shift and my perspectives really started to align, and I really set forth plans that were going to lead to things like Matter existing. So I think there's a pretty big reference to this point in my life that's at least worth talking about and exploring, so that people can comprehend really how you can perceive death without such a sadness and grief and sense of hopelessness and learned hopelessness, loss. So I think a lot of people have a taboo misconception around death that I think needs to change, and perhaps we need to shift our perspective on entirely. For instance, just the simple benign fact that we use death as a point of loss and sadness, but we rarely use death to reflect on the thing that was, the person that was, the life that was lived, and that sort of thing. So to me, I use that moment for that, the latter of the conversation, that is to look at the man who was and the man who lived, not the man who was gone, the person who has been taken away. You know, that separation of choice then, that I will never get to see him further than he was, but instead of looking at the time that's lost, I get to enjoy the fact that there was time that is, and there was time that was. So I think that's a big shift that a lot of people perhaps aren't willing to grasp, or we some reason aren't allowed to have that conversation, or it's not enjoyed, or people fear it. I'm not sure, but I guess that's what makes it taboo. And I think there's a lot to learn in death that people are afraid of and scared of, that can really shift how we view life. Because there is the duality of existence, right? That is the duality that we experience and go through, is that if there is life, there is death. If there is death, it means there was a life. And that is a pretty powerful thing when you think about it, but we don't think about it. And this point in time was a pretty significant crossroads for me, I believe, where I just recently, I was just towards the end of a relationship that did not serve me, was not good for me. It was definitely a loss of my identity and who I was and everything that I stood for. And that moment then of losing my father really put things into perspective of what I was willing to do and what I was willing to do with life, and what I was willing to accept and cop and sort of settle for. And so if we really, really go back to it, is the original, the diagnosis, or the clutch for him was terminal cancer, He had multiple myelomas. He had Addison's disease. He had Hashimoto's. He had, oh God, the plethora of diseases and viruses that he had towards the end there that really took him finally. But the original stepping stone was when I was about 16, which is actually, I don't think it's a pretty heavy thing to think about at 16, which I really only comprehended not too long ago, was that I was about 15 or 16 the first time we were told that he was going to be terminally ill and pass even back then. Now, fortunately for him, the diagnosis from the doctors was very, very, very wrong. Their treatments for him were very off. Their prescriptions and medications for him were very, very misinformed. And luckily, we got him to a better facility and a better healthcare facility to get proper treatment and figure out what was going on. And eventually they did. A little too late, but managed to score some extra time with him that those discoveries allowed, which led to, oh God, 12, 10 years past the point he was originally diagnosed. And it was kind of like, this was to me where I first really started to recognize the work ethic a man can have and the drive to survive that a man can have, and just how much the human body and the mind is actually capable of. And it's not something you can really experience until it's firsthand or in person or around you day to day, every single day of your life. That is watching someone be diagnosed terminally, be diagnosed with a killing disease or virus that they can then somehow muster the effort to fight off and prevent or delay and offset for at least another decade. When you think about someone who only makes it to 60 years old, they spend 1/6 of their life fighting a killer disease and viruses that most people would have lost in a year or 2 years. And so when you really look at that, it starts to put a fair few things into perspective. And I don't really think I grasped the significance of that as heavily as I should have back then, which I guess is the joy of hindsight, right? We get to reflect and look back and think what if, or what we should have done, or what would have been better, or how important that moment was. And that, in conjunction with the competitive nature that I had, really set forth a few things that I think were underlying, even when I was in relationships and things like that I part of me never really wanted, part of me was never really happy with or content with or satisfied with. And the idea of settling never laid well with me. It was never something it was never a question that I looked forward to. It was never something that I was happy with. And it was only ever in pursuit of things that I sucked at, that I wanted to get bigger or better at, that I really find a sense of accomplishment and sense of purpose. And I think a part of that resonated from the fact that when you look at someone dying and their whole point of existence is to survive and be around and still be here in years to come, their purpose becomes clear, that it's survival. You start to realize how lucky you are to have that ability, or that pleasure, that potential to do something more than that. When obviously your entire life is focused towards survival and existence, and you can kind of see that then that someone like my life gets to be more than that. I get to look at the fact that was his life for the better part of 10 years. And I can look at that and say, that's not enough. I need to make the most of the time that I have, that the time that he's given me, being my father. I need to be able to put that time into practice and use and actually make the most of it, because there's more to life than simply just surviving. There is more to life than just simply existing. There is thriving. And for him, it was simply trying to get back to that point of thriving through the painful fact of surviving. To survive, God, the treatments that he went through that I had to take him to was beyond me, that someone could survive those things. I guess the next part for that was that at roughly the time of my accident, which was I was 21. So again, a pretty huge milestone that we'll get into another day as well. Around that time, that very same time when I was working, I remember seeing, I was seeing the first Thor movie down the Gold Coast, and I received a phone call from my mother, and that was to say that I may need to come home this weekend, as I was living down the Gold Coast, working down there as an apprentice chippy. And I just taken myself to see a movie because I just like to do those things on my own. Sometimes I like time off. And I left the cinema to take the call to say that this time he was terminal again, and the treatments hadn't worked last time, and the treatments weren't working this time, and it would be another bout of radiation and another bout of chemo and another bout of treatment, because the cancer is not benign. The cancer is terminal and will grow. So to top off then being hit by a car, which followed this phone call, I was then made or asked to be the primary carer of my father, give or take, that my issues were going on and my court cases were going on, my problems were going on, my pain, my diagnosis, my treatment, my rehab. As it wasn't someone that needed, he wasn't someone that needed to be carried and lifted and pushed around. It was someone that needed to be cared for, maintained, looked after, helped, driven around, supported. I could do that with little to no interference with the rest of the problems that I already had. So that was kind of like the first shift for me, really being around it full time, where I suppose I was around it full time as a kid. I didn't really grasp it, but as an adult, to be around your father dying, for me, that was a pretty heavy thing to be a part of, because it started to shift my perspective. Like, perhaps my back isn't that bad. And I think this is where a lot of the shift started to come from, that perhaps people aren't exposed to, or, when we go through something, we like to look for, how bad we have it compared to other people, and we're the worst victim possible. And we need to play the victim card and the victim mentality to get favor and get sympathy and pity. And we have to look at who has it worse. And every time someone says something, I've got it worse than you. When you're hit by a car and you're still able to get up and do things, you can still take yourself to rehab and treatment. And yes, I'm not minimizing the fact that this pain that I went through was excruciating, but to witness the excruciating pain that he was going through and be around the diagnosis, the treatments, the calls, the phone calls, the failures, the setbacks, the organ failures, to be, around those things and watch him push through them, suddenly my training and my rehab, my re-strengthening, my rebuilding phase was not as tough. It was nowhere near as bad. It was nowhere near as intense. And if he can get through X, then I can definitely get through Y. And that was kind of the perspective that I started to develop around the fact that I also had a very competitive mindset around life in general. He gave me the visual representation that you can push more. There's more to give. And it was kind of re-ingrained into me when I read David Goggins' You Can't Hurt Me. And he emphasizes the 40% rule. When you think you're done, there's 40% left. There's at least 40% left. And when you're told for the better part of 10 years that you are going to die, and you still manage to steal another day, and you steal another day, and you steal another day, it is pretty significant. It's a pretty clear representation of what the human body is capable of doing. And I don't think enough people really grasp that when they look at these things. Like, every time I hear people talk about how hard they have it and how bad they have it, I often just want to grab them or take them to a place like a treatment facility or a chemo facility and expose them to what people go through in there and continue to go through just for the sheer sake of survival. And you start to witness how not bad you have it. Yes, you can't take away from everyone's individual stories, but if we're only going to look at I have it the worst, then every single time we look at someone, they're the worst possible person or they have the worst possible experience. It's just not true. There is always going to be someone worse than you and worse than what you have, worse than the situation you're in. There just has to be someone, especially when we live in places like Australia, where there is just going to be worse people off than you, and they're pushing through to make things happen. When you're victimizing yourself because of the fact that someone put something wrong in your coffee, or you missed a few hours of pay and things like this, or even things even sillier than that, like things that happen in the gym and stuff like that, where someone took a dumbbell or someone took your plates, and it's like this perspective of like, oh God, this worst thing happening. Like, you throw that around too easy. When you watch someone go through these things, suddenly your perspective changes on life, and you start to see how good you actually have it, and the capacity for potential that you have, and that you're not acting on it. And that was, for me, the big moment where I really clicked that I wasn't doing everything I could to be everything I could. And that was the problem for me. That was the clicker, that I needed to do more. I need to stop living how I was living. I didn't like drinking. I didn't like going out. I didn't like partying, but I was doing these things in conjunction with trying to fit in with football teams and people who were playing in the teams that I was in, and that sort of thing, to be a part of the team spirit and the community. I felt like I had to do that stuff. And it got to a point where I was watching this life dwindle away from a man who was fighting every single day to just simply survive. And I couldn't think hard enough that that wasn't enough for me. It was consistently in the back of my mind that that was nowhere near enough. And I was wasting time. I was wasting life. And you look at this, like you look at people who are trying to do more than that just to simply survive. They're trying to do more to not die. And you're doing things you don't like or even enjoy because someone else thinks you should do them, or because a team thinks you should do them, or because society implies that's part of it. And it got to a point where for me, that just wasn't enough. And that wasn't what I was going to do. It wasn't what I was here to do. And that then it pushed me even further to go through my rehab and push through the things that I was willing to do, embrace the suck, get through the crappy parts of rehab, get through the crappy parts of the pain, because to be fair, I'm still alive. To be fair, I'm still able to exist. I'm still able to move. I can walk. It's agonizing, but I can still walk. I can sleep. It's in a few hours, but I can sleep. I'm alive enough to know that I can sleep. I'm awake enough to know that I can move. In order for me to experience pain, it means I'm alive. That's the crazy thing to me, is when we get to experience these pains and these situations and these circumstances. Yes, it sucks, and pain is never a good thing. Like serious pain is not obviously something good, but if it's a pain that you can mend and fix, is that not better than not having any pain because you're dead, and because that you've simply gone through something like cancers and you passed away? Like that, to me, I will take the pain of a sore back every single day, because it means it's something I can fix and work on and progress and get better. To a degree, there's always going to be a handicap for sure. I was diagnosed with that. There was a clinical disability diagnosis, but 10% of my back being disabled is better than 100% of me being dead. And that comparison in my head is kind of how I then started to shift and view life. I started to really focus on exploring things like stoicism and understanding the concept of memento mori, and understanding that a day shall come where you will die, and that every day you live is a day closer to the day you're dying. And therefore, the time you have to make the most of is a time now that you have, and you have to put it towards something important or something significant that you're trying to achieve. Otherwise, you're just simply going through life in order to die. And when you watch someone going through life dying, and they are trying to fight every single minute of every single day to not do that, it's such a wasted, it's such a hard reflection to take in and digest, because you have to watch, you're watching someone fight for the very thing that you're wasting, knowing full well they're not going to get it, but they continue to fight for it anyway. And if that isn't enough to motivate you to do something better, then I don't know what is, which is huge for me, because some people go through most of their life without experiencing deaths or griefs or losses or passings or injuries, and they don't experience these things till later in life, and they get met with a whole lot of regret, unfulfillment, unfulfilled potential, unfulfilled ideas, poor reflections on the life they lived, because everything was just about ease and comfort and pleasure, as if we're supposed to avoid pain and suffering and the struggles of life. Luckily, and I say luckily for me in a very loose term, but in a lucky roundabout way, I experienced the borderline worst things life has to offer in the space of 2 years, in the space of actually the better part of the space of 6 months. From there was things that stemmed off, like breakups, several relationships, outbursts and partying lifestyles that I don't regret, but regret is not something that I would want to do again. But they're experiences that I had, and they're things that I went through from the fact that I went through those other things. They were significant events. And to have them out of the way at 21 to 25 is pretty huge comparatively to people who may have them, later on at 50, 60, and have that midlife reflection that shit, they've got to change things now. I've only got 20 years left statistically, 25 years left statistically. I need to shift and start living what I have left. For me, I get that now. I've already got that. I've got that at the age I have it. I get to shift how I view things. I get to shift on what I want to achieve in life, what I want to do with the time I have, what I want to do with the business that I have, what I want to do with the people that I can reach, because I think more people need to see this perspective when it comes to loss and grief and suffering and pain, anguish. It's not about accepting being a victim. It's not about how hard you have it. It's not about that you have it worse than anyone else. It's about the fact that you reflect on how bad you have it, perhaps, and what you can do to improve it, what you can do to progress it, what you can do to make it better. Everyone has something they're a victim of. If you look hard enough, there is something that you've experienced, that you have been victimized for. there's obviously degrees and intensity to that statement. So before anyone attacks that sort of sentiment, there is obviously degrees and variance to that statement. But it's up to you to then progress that and figure out how to improve that, how to change the circumstance, or how to get past the situation so that you don't remain in that position forever until it's too late and you look back and realize you've wasted 50 years. And that to me is the reflection that I got to have from spending 2 years watching this man pass. Again, luckily he overcame the first time that I looked after him and he was told he was terminal. It wasn't until 4 years later, which was a kind of sad, fulfilled prophecy that doctors really gave. It was they really gave that pretty specific diagnosis. Should you survive this bout, we will really only be buying you another 5 to 10 years at best. He got another 5 out-ish before it really took over and kicked in again. Unfortunately, he was only born with 1 kidney. And then as a young male playing sport in Australia in the 70s and 80s, that also got pretty heavily hit with drinking culture, lack of sleep, partying, poor food choices, lack of nutritional knowledge, all that jazz. So, all these behaviors and choices really affected me or led to me wanting to better understand things so that I could help. And that 5 years that he did get was great, but eventually it did pass and he did succumb to those diseases and illness as the doctors kind of prescribed that would happen. But you really shift perspective on how bad you actually have it, how bad things really are, and what you can actually bounce back from. And having that is something that I encourage a lot of people to try and explore, because it's not, to me, it's not so, it shouldn't be socially acceptable to wallow in self-pity and say, woe is me, and stay where you are. Now, that isn't to say that you can't have self-compassion. It's not to say that you can't have acceptance. It's not to say that you can't have problems, but it's more about how bad do I really have it? And is this stopping me from progressing in life? Can I get this better? Can I make this better? Can I do something today that is going to reduce the pain and suffering that I'm experiencing to take me further in life? It doesn't matter if it's one day, one tiny thing, one day at a time, and you spend the next 20 years trying to figure that out and fix it. That time is going to pass anyway. We are all going to pass through time the same way. It's what you do with that time in between that makes the big difference. Am I going to spend that time wallowing in self-pity, saying how hard my life is when there's people around me tenfold worse than what I have it, and then end up 20 years down the track in the exact same position, saying the same thing, and then changing my mind? Or do I look at it now, take ownership of the fact that, or even you can't take responsibility for a lot of things that have happened to you, especially the earliest parts of life. That's something that I always try to encourage people. You are not responsible for what's happened to you, but you damn well better take ownership of where you are. Own the starting position, own the starting platform, and you take off from what you have. You don't complain about the fact you don't have the XYZ. So if you can do that, and you can look at the situational position that you're in, and you can shift that perspective and look at the fact that there is definitely people worse off than me. There are people suffering far worse than I am that have got through and got better things than I did. When you start to shape that, you start to realize how important every day is and every minute becomes. And sure, there's times I procrastinate, there's things I waste getting done. I have a very scattered attention span. That's like, I understand that. And for some people, that's the case. But when you have that perspective of how short life gets to be and how quickly things can pass and how quickly 10 years goes by, you start to realize that you at least want to spend most of that progressing towards some specific outcome. Not a 5-day work week that takes you to a weekend to drink away the things that you hate doing and then repeat that again on Monday because you drank away the weekend and actually work towards anything. It clarifies and it kind of presents itself that life is way too short for that, and life is way too specific, and life is way too available to us, especially in 2022, to want to spend that time disgruntled, pissed off, frustrated, victimized, playing the victim card, that weak mentality that you're supposed to have it all because you suffered for 5 minutes and therefore you should have it. There are people who are going to suffer tenfold more than you who don't have anything, and they will continue to suffer and still progress and try and fight through life to get the things they want. Why should we simply get something because we suffered for a minute? Why should we simply get something in life because we suffered for a second, when there are people who suffer tenfold longer and tenfold harder than we will, or I will? I'll speak on my behalf so that no one's triggered or offended by this. Why should I then simply get success? Why should I simply get the things I want because I suffered for a few minutes? When you look at the grand scheme of a life, going through a year of hell and experiencing these things, when I watched my dad go through a year, 10 years of it, even before that, his childhood, understanding his upbringing, there was better part of maybe 10, 15 years in his life where there wasn't something significantly suffering. So how can I say that I have it hard and I have these problems? I have a bad back and my back is slightly broken and I've got to work. I can work to progress that. You can't work to progress terminal cancer. That's not something that you can simply just work to get better. You can work to reduce, you could work to prevent, or you could work to delay, but it's going to come. It's that shadow that is going to consistently chase you until the time it comes that it catches up. And once it gets you, that's it. A back problem to me is not as significant as that. I don't get to play the victim card knowing that story. I don't get to play the victim card watching him fight those things to then say, well, I've got it hard too. No, I don't. I don't. I have a situation I need to overcome and figure out how to get better. And when I do, then when you look at these situations, you can look at these things from a more of a growth perspective. You're able to look at it and go, if I can get through these things, and I've gone through these things, there is literally nothing life can throw me that I can't overcome. I had zeros in my bank account because of court costs and lawyers and fees and not being able to work and people not insuring me to get jobs because of these accidents. I had literal zeros in my account as a 20-something-year-old male. I can tell you, in the hierarchy of importance and significance, when you're trying to find relationships and people that you care about or trying to find intimate partnerships, having zeros in your bank account and going through court battles to say that you are borderline disabled at a certain degree is not the most primary or desired partnership or mate. That was a pretty heavy thing that I reflected on and realized as it was happening, that I'm not the most ideal person at this point in time. Having those zeros in my account, having that mentality of trying to justify to myself that these things are rational, that I should continue to pursue this case because I was wrongfully affected by someone else's decisions. But at the same time, like that's 4 years of my life spent doing those things. And I'm limited by the fact that those things are happening. It's not an easy situation, but at the same time, it's nowhere near as bad as dying from cancer, right? It's nowhere near as bad as dying from a disease that you had no consequence, you had no control over, that was outside of your control. That was a consequence of genetics and environmental factors. So when I look at these things, I look at that perspective and think that if I can get through what I did go through and I can watch this person get through those things, I can sit beside his chair and I can watch him take the chemotherapy, the radiation treatment. To put it into perspective, the dose was that high. They literally described it as a small bout of 10,000 times the dose of the standard radiation treatment used to treat someone with a mild bout of cancer. The entire premise of his specific treatment was to shut down his whole system and reignite it down the track with stem cells. Something along those lines. I can't remember exactly how the diagnosis of the plan worked. But when you hear that numbers like that and you watch him take that and cop it every day that we went there for that treatment, you drive him there to see it, you start to realize how not that bad things actually are and what you have. So that was an eye-opener and a shift in perspective and sort of life for me is I need to make the most of why I'm here. I need to do the most of why I'm here. I need to make peace with the fact that I'm going to suffer through things for a while in order for me to get the success I want. There'll be suffering, but it's nowhere near as bad. And once you accept, and this is no different, I explain the similar premise to people when we talk about dieting and being hungry. When you accept the existence of the hunger, when you accept the existence of suffering, that you can't simply just get rid of it, life to a degree is always going to be some form of suffering to get the things that we want. It makes it easier to get it. It makes it easier to work towards it because you know it's coming. You know that experience is going to happen. You know that you're going to feel those sensations, those problems, those adversities, those circumstances, and you're able to work through them because it's expected. When you experience that hunger, when you experience diet fatigue, when you experience the brain slumps, you're able to accept that it's going to happen. You can push through it because you know it's there. You know it's going to happen. You can't pretend that the diet doesn't exist or that you shouldn't ever be hungry. You accept those things and progress with it. Anyway, that's kind of like a bit of a heavy early opener on in the podcast, but I think the point to this was basically trying to get the conversation out there that was how it went down for me. That was sort of how things happen and how I perceive them. And I'm sure that even my mum probably doesn't look at it that way. I'm sure there's part of my family that don't look at it that way, but I was able to look at as his carer, as his, to a point, to a degree, I would say he was my best friend for 2 years. We did everything together. We hung out together every single day. There was nothing I couldn't do that wasn't including of him, because I had to make sure that he was okay. Basically, the concept was that he had a zero platelet count. Anyone knows anything about bloods and your blood count? A platelet is something that enables the body to scab and heal and prevent blood loss. If he were to scratch himself shaving, or if he were to cut himself doing something and didn't notice, he would have continually bled out until he died or got into a hospital, because he had zero platelets, which was a huge deal for someone who, when we live in somewhat of the sticks and we live in the bush, and you like to be out doing yard work, and you like to be out riding his mower and doing sort of things on the property, that's a big deal. So to watch that and see that sort of unfold, and that progression and how he handled it, it was kind of a big eye opener for me. And I think a lot of people need to understand that watching someone that close to you go through that is a really big shift in how you view life, and it should be. And I think that's an important point that I'm trying to get across here, is that you're able to reflect on these things. And when you can reflect on these things, it doesn't have to be taboo. It doesn't have to be bad. It doesn't have to be sad. It's not grief. I am more content, and I'm more happy with the time he did have and the time we did have together, because there was a very part of early childhood where we didn't get to spend a lot of time together because of his job, that we got to spend that time to get together and get to know each other and learn all these things about each other. And I can then use that to progress forward and look how I can use his suffering to make my life better. Because if he suffered for nothing, then what was the point? If the whole point was for him to suffer just to die anyway, then it's kind of a letdown, and it's kind of a waste of the time. So if he's going to suffer, and he's going to suffer to push me, he's going to suffer to stay around and survive and keep going, shouldn't I then utilize that in a way that's going to help me be better in life, get the most out of life that he gave me and he fought to keep around? So that was kind of the premise of trying to get through there, is that, and hopefully you've taken that away, or you've understood it. If you have any questions, if you're going through things, if you're suffering through things, please reach out, message me, contact me, got questions. Nothing about this is a closed book to me. I don't know if the rest of my family's gonna be upset about that, but I talk about this all the time, and it's something that I think a lot of people can benefit from. So to me, it was just simply going to be an episode to discuss those things and really dive more into where that moment in my time that shifted things for me and sort of like pushed my perspective to be more intense than it already was. So hopefully you enjoyed the episode. Again, if you have any questions, please reach out. If you have any questions for another episode, or anything else to explore around that, any questions for me to answer at the end of episodes, please let me know, and we can start to do like some Q&As and things like that. Please remember that coaching is still available. And if you have any questions, guys, please flick me a message on Instagram, social media, on the Facebook group, anything you want. I'll be there, and there are plenty of times that I will be able to engage and get back to you. And that is it for us this episode, and I'll be back with another one in a couple of days. All right, guys, catches.